The truth hits you before the music does. A young man with a once-in-a-generation voice rose in the 90s, lifted others to glory, and vanished before most people ever learned his name. Kenny Greene was that man, and his story begins with a question that refuses to stay quiet. How does someone who shaped the sound of an entire era disappear without the world noticing? In those years, R&B was not just a genre, it was a lifeline. It carried the weight of Black America, its joy, its heartbreak, its need to be heard. And in the middle of that storm stood Kenny, a voice so pure it could make a crowded club fall still, a voice powerful enough to help launch the careers of giants. Yet behind the songs he gave, the world was a truth he carried alone. A truth that followed him from Detroit church pews to military bases to New York studios where legends were born. And in the end, the silence around him was louder than his success. It was the kind of silence that erases people, the kind that takes a life long before the world realizes what it has lost. Kenny Greene grew up in Detroit, in a neighborhood where music was not a hobby. It was a language. It lived in the walls of every home, carried through open windows, carried through church doors on Sunday mornings. His family sang gospel with the kind of conviction that made faith feel like a sound you could touch. As a boy, Kenny learned early that a voice could hold more than melody. It could carry history. It could carry hope. He spent hours in those wooden pews, listening, absorbing, shaping his breath into something that felt like it belonged to him alone. The church was his first audience. It was also the first place where silence broke for him. But Detroit could be a hard teacher, and like many young men searching for direction, Kenny left home at 18 and enlisted in the army. He did not go there seeking a stage. Yet, even in uniform, his voice found a way out. On military bases where days were long and nights were lonely, he sang at talent shows, sometimes behind an old piano, sometimes with nothing but the room listening. It was there that he met Clinton Buddy White, another soldier with music stitched into his bones. Their voices recognized each other first. Their friendship came after. They were two black men far from home, carrying pieces of the same dream without knowing it yet. When their service paths split, Kenny stepped away from the military, hoping music might claim him the way it once did in Detroit. Buddy stayed. But fate had another turn waiting. A friend from Brooklyn, Jeff Sanders, was searching for singers to form a new group. He had the vision, he had the hunger, but he needed one more voice. Buddy made the call. Kenny answered, and sometimes the simplest choices redirect entire lives. Kenny traveled to New York, carrying little more than his voice and a quiet certainty that he belonged somewhere. Music breathed. In cramped rehearsal rooms and small apartments, the three men worked. Day after day, 4 months straight. No shortcuts, no promises. Just the grit that comes from believing in something you cannot yet see. They named themselves Intro. Innovative, new talent reaching out. A declaration, a warning, a hope. It was the kind of name chosen by young men who believed the world might listen if they yelled loud enough. But the truth was different. They did not need to yell. Their sound was already strong. And one night, in a crowded New York club, as they stood under dim lights and let their harmonies speak for them, someone powerful listened. Heavy D heard them, and everything began to shift. When Intro stepped into the studio for the first time with Heavy D and Eddie F, something shifted around them. It was not fame. Not yet. But the sense that they were finally standing in a room where their sound belonged. Heavy D saw what many others had missed. He saw the sharp edges in their harmony, the softness in their delivery, and the way Kenny's voice carried the weight of an entire arrangement without ever overpowering it. Their early work came fast. They recorded background vocals. They shaped hooks. They learned how studios breathe. One of their first appearances was on Try My Love, a track by Shinehead that needed warmth, texture, and a steady hand. Kenny delivered that. He could slide into a song without bending it, lift a track without taking ownership of it. Producers noticed, writers noticed, and slowly, the circle around Intro widened, but it was in the writing rooms, not the recording booths, where Kenny became something rare, a storyteller, a craftsman, a quiet force behind voices that were about to reshape R&B. He worked closely with Dave Jam Hall, a producer and writer who understood the discipline behind simplicity. Together, they built songs that stayed, songs that did not rely on flash, but on truth. In the early 90s, Mary J Blige was preparing her debut, and the label needed material that felt raw enough for the streets but soulful enough for the church. Intro had exactly that. They played Reminisce for her. They played Love No Limit. They played My Love. Mary heard herself in those songs. Diddy heard The Future, and they begged Intro to let her record them. Most young artists would have held on tight, afraid of losing their shot. But Kenny understood something deeper. A song finds the voice it was meant for, and sometimes giving a song away is the fastest way to be remembered. Those tracks became part of Mary's foundation, and Kenny's writing, paired with Dave Jam Hall's production, became impossible to ignore. Their work earned them the ASCAP Songwriter of the Year award, sharing the honor with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who had shaped Janet Jackson's biggest era. It was the kind of recognition that slipped quietly into Kenny's hands, but its weight was unforgettable. Then came Intro's debut album in 1993, Love Thing, Let Me Be the One, Come Inside. Each track pushed their voices further into the public ear, but it was their reimagining of Ribbon in the Sky that changed the trajectory of the group. Taking on a Stevie Wonder classic required courage. Making it their own required soul. Kenny delivered both. The album went gold. The tours followed. 2 years. Non-stop. Crowded clubs. Late flights. Sleepless nights. Rooms filled with women who knew every note before the group even opened their mouths. Intro had arrived. And Kenny, standing in the center of that harmony, carried the sound that made strangers close their eyes just to feel it more deeply. For a moment, everything they had dreamed of was within reach. For a moment, the world finally heard him. Success is never a straight line. Not in music, not in life. And for Kenny Greene, the climb upward came with a shadow that followed quietly behind him, waiting for the moment the world stopped applauding long enough to notice it. After the Gold album and the endless touring, Intro stepped back into the studio to chase the next chapter. The industry had changed. Hip-hop had swallowed radio playlists, reshaping what Black America danced to, cried to, and survived with. R&B groups were still loved, but the ground beneath them was shifting, and not in their favor. Intro released New Life in 1995. It carried strong songs, careful harmonies, and the same commitment that built their first album. But the world did not pause for it. Sales dipped, airplay faded, and the group felt the pressure that every artist dreads, the pressure that whispers that maybe the moment has already passed. Inside the group, tension grew, not the explosive kind, but the kind that wears people down quietly. Long tours had carved deep lines of exhaustion. Creative direction pulled them in different ways. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Kenny felt himself slipping out of place. The harmony that once held them together began to thin. Eventually, the bond snapped. Kenny left the group. He did not storm out. He simply stepped away, carrying the same voice that once lifted arenas and now had to carry him alone. For many artists, this would have been the end. But Kenny had always been more than a performer. He was a writer, a collaborator, a man who could walk into a studio and leave it with a song that fit someone else's spirit better than it fit his own. So he worked, quietly, constantly. He wrote for Tevin Campbell, lending softness to a voice that already knew vulnerability well. He worked with Will Smith, shaping melodies behind the actor turned rapper who was reaching global fame. He recorded with Cameron as hip-hop tightened its grip on the charts. He lent his pen to AZ, to Tyrese, to 98 Degrees, to So For Real, to young artists searching for a sound that felt like the 90s still had room to breathe. His voice was everywhere, except attached to his own name. But while the music continued, his life carried a weight he rarely shared. The late 90s were a difficult time for black queer men, especially in entertainment. Rumors circled him long before truth ever did, and the industry was not gentle with men who did not fit the image they were expected to maintain. In July 2001, Kenny spoke for himself. He came out as bisexual. For some, it was courage. For others, it was confirmation of whispers they never had the compassion to question. Months later, in an interview with Sister Sister magazine, he revealed the truth he had carried in silence. He was living with AIDS. It was the kind of confession that felt heavier than the illness itself. At that time, AIDS was still a sentence, but an emotional one as much as a medical one. People feared it. People judged it. And people rarely knew how to love someone who said those words out loud. Kenny did not ask for sympathy. He simply told the truth. And in a world that rarely makes room for honesty, the truth isolated him more than the disease did. His body weakened. His circle thinned. The voice that once commanded rooms was growing quiet. And the world did not notice. Not yet. To understand the weight of Kenny Greene's final years, You have to understand America in the 90s. It was a country caught between progress and fear, between new voices rising and old prejudices refusing to fall. For black men in entertainment, identity was a stage with no room for mistakes, and even less room for truth. The music world celebrated talent, but only the parts of it that felt safe. R&B was built on vulnerability, yet the industry demanded masks. Men were expected to be strong, smooth, unshakable. Women were allowed heartbreak. Men were allowed charm. Anything outside those lines became a threat to the image that labels worked to protect. So when rumors about Kenny's sexuality began to circulate, they moved quietly but harshly, the way whispers do when people fear what they cannot name. The 90s were not kind to queer black men, especially in the public eye. The world was changing, but not fast enough. Acceptance lived in small pockets, not in the mainstream. And in the spaces where black art thrived, queerness was often acknowledged privately, but punished publicly. Then came the weight of the AIDS crisis. By the time Kenny spoke his truth, America had spent years watching the epidemic through a lens clouded by fear, moral judgment, and misinformation. The disease was treated not only as a threat, but as a verdict. It stripped people of dignity long before it took their lives. And the silence it created was louder than the crisis itself. For black communities, the stigma was even sharper. Access to healthcare was inconsistent. Education around the illness was uneven. And conversations about sexuality often lived behind closed doors, spoken in tones meant to warn rather than understand. Kenny walked through that world with a truth that left him exposed in ways his talent never could. The industry did not rally around him. America did not pause to acknowledge his contributions. His songwriting shaped the careers of artists who would become household names. Yet the country that danced to his melodies did not see the man behind them. But the world also shifts quietly, and sometimes legacy moves slower than life. In recent years, music historians, listeners, and fans of 90s R&B have begun to revisit the voices that stood behind the era's brightest stars. Kenny's influence is clearer now, easier to trace, easier to honor. His work with Mary J Blige, Mariah Carey, and countless others helped define what the decade sounded like. And in communities across America, especially among older black listeners who lived through the rise of R&B, there is a growing recognition that men like Kenny carried more than melodies. They carried the burden of being unseen. They carried stories America was not yet ready to hear. The world is still learning how to hold these stories with care, but it is learning. In the final months of his life, Kenny Greene did not stand on a stage. There were no lights, no applause, no crowded rooms waiting for the first note to fall. Instead, there was a small circle of friends, a quiet struggle, and a voice that had once filled studios, now fading into the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. On October 1st, 2001, that silence became permanent. Kenny passed away in New York City at the age of 32 from complications of AIDS. His family did not attend his wake. His final moments were held not by those who raised him, but by those who had worked beside him, sung beside him, believed in him when the world looked away. He was laid to rest at Calverton National Cemetery on Long Island, a military burial for a man whose voice had once lifted beyond any uniform he ever wore. It was a quiet ending, too quiet for someone whose music still lingers in the memories of those who grew up with 90s R&B humming through their homes. But endings do not erase the truth, and Kenny's truth is this: he left behind more than the world realized. His writing shaped the foundation of Mary J Blige's earliest sound, a sound that carried millions of listeners through their own heartbreaks and healing. His work echoed in the careers of artists across genres, his harmonies tucked into albums that outlived him by decades. Even now, listeners hear his influence without knowing his name, the way a shadow can appear in a room long after the person is gone. Legacy is not only measured by fame. Sometimes it is measured by the fingerprints left on other people's success, by the songs that continue to breathe long after the songwriter is gone. And Kenny's work breathes still. In the refrains of Reminisce, in the warmth of Love No Limit, in the echoes of Ribbon in the Sky that carried intro into the hearts of listeners across America. For anyone who has ever stood alone in a crowded room, Kenny's story is a reminder that brilliance does not always shield us from the world, but it also teaches us something quieter, something truer. Some stories end without closure, but dignity does not need applause. So to the listeners who lived through those years, to the ones who remember the rise of R&B as more than a trend, as a lifeline, his story is also yours. If his music ever found you in a hard moment, if his voice ever made you close your eyes and breathe a little deeper, then you carry a piece of him too. And if this story reminds you of someone, write their name below. We read every word.